to our fourth session of our journey with Jesus through the Gospel of Mark here in 2021. Today we're going to be taking a look at chapter 4 of Mark's Gospel, which centers on stories that Jesus tells. And Mark asks an interesting question: why does Jesus tell things through stories and enact things in sort of lived stories? And join us here today as we take a look at chapter 4 and the parables and the storyteller. Chapter 4 Mark's Gospel begins like this. Again, Jesus began to teach beside the sea. Such a very large crowd gathered around him that he got into a boat on the sea and sat there while the whole crowd was beside the sea on the land. He began to teach them many things in parables. And in his teaching, he said to them, "Listen, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell on a path, and the birds came and ate it up. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it did not have much soil, and it sprang up quickly since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun arose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. Other seed fell into good soil and brought forth grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30 and 60 and 100-fold. And he said, 'Let anyone with ears to hear listen.'" Now, this is a weird thing that's about to happen in the gospel, in the story of Jesus, because Jesus just told a story, and in the very next section, we're going to get a scene where Jesus gathers his disciple around them and explains what the story is all about. Sometimes Jesus does that in his story. Sometimes the gospel writers will give us a story Jesus tells, and then Jesus will kind of unpack that story for us. The way a preacher will tell a story and then expound on it. The way any children's object lesson will be, here's the visual and now here's what it all means. The way Aesop's fables have a story with a talking fox or a duck or something like that, and then there will be a moral at the end of the story. Jesus doesn't always do that. In fact, in a lot of Jesus' most well-known stories, he doesn't. He lets the story speak on its own terms. And in fact, before the end of this chapter is out, Jesus is going to give us more word pictures, stories, but without explanations, without him walking through us with each thing representing something else. But he's about to do that here. So I want us to pay close attention as we begin exploring some of Jesus' stories about what they do, why Jesus tells the story the way he does, when he chooses to give an explanation step by step, and when he chooses to leave things a little bit broader. Let's talk right now a little bit of overview terms before we get into the weeds with some actual parables Jesus tells. First off, parables, like jokes, work at different levels. There are some jokes that are one-liners. There's one thing that's funny about it, and that's it. There are some kind of jokes that have a long build-up and very little punchline at the end. We say those have a long climb for a short slide. There are other jokes that are almost sort of humorous stories where there may be several things along the way, and there's a punchline sure at the end, but almost you need the whole thing to get the whole experience of it. And parables work the same way. Some parables have a very sharp, pointed ending, and Jesus will underscore it by saying, and by the way, the meaning of this parable is such and such. On the other hand, sometimes Jesus just gives us a visual, a story, a set of characters, and leaves it like a mystery for us to sort of unravel. The way sometimes you might love a song and find it very profound, and it's an earworm, it gets stuck in your head, but you're not quite sure why. The words kind of work on you, and it may not be that it's danceable or particularly catchy in a rhythmic way, but there's something about it that seems haunting. Jesus' stories sometimes are like that. So instead of forcing all of Jesus' stories to fit into our cookie-cutter assumptions and say, oh, well, they're all fables, so they should all have a one-sentence moral at the end, they don't all work like that. For that matter, Jesus' stories aren't always about good people getting good rewards at the end and bad people getting punished. In fact, a lot of times Jesus picks people who are scandalous villains to be the center figures of his story. A crook who gets fired for being crooked, and Jesus praises the crook at the end of the story. Or a son who is wasteful, who gets welcomed home, and the father who's even more extravagant and ridiculously loving, who welcomes him home. A shepherd who does the business sense foolish thing of leaving 99% of his flock to go get one lost sheep when the other 99 can make more sheep with enough time. Jesus does things without saying, here's a good example of what you're supposed to do, but using images from ordinary life and turning them just a little bit to help us to see who God is and what God's reign is like. And that, dear ones, is really what I think the interpretive key to all of Jesus' parables, especially in Mark's gospel, is all about. Sometimes Jesus will come out and say, the kingdom of God is like, or the as we've been saying, the reign of God, or the Yahweh administration. You want to know what it's like where God runs the world? You want to know what it's like how God runs the universe? Let me tell you. And then Jesus will give stories with illustrations that are meant to put in ordinary human terms. Oh, it's like this, but how God sees the whole world. So instead of treating these like stories about how to be good little boys and good little girls, these say an awful lot more about God. Now, secondarily, sometimes that will say something to you and me about how we're supposed to live in light of who God is. But Jesus is convinced the first thing we need to be clear about is who and what God is like. And if we had assumptions about who God is and how they run up against Jesus' picture, Jesus is saying, I need you to trust me on this. Trust my storytelling rather than what your gut told you about who God is. The other thing I want us to say at the outset about how Jesus' parables work is, in some ways, because they are stories, or at most like vignettes or little object lessons, they have a way of getting under our skin, getting beneath our radar in a way that just yelling at us or telling us, do this, don't do that, wouldn't do. We shut down when somebody tells us, you shouldn't do this, or be good or something. Or even, Jesus doesn't usually give us sort of propositional truths that you must believe at the end of the story. Jesus doesn't give us a catechism. Jesus doesn't give us a creed. Jesus says, God is like this. And it sort of forces us to do some wrestling. Well, how is God like a farmer? How is God like a woman sweeping her house? How is God like a mother hen? How is God like the wind that blows where it wills? When we have to engage it that way, something's happening in our brains. We're doing critical thinking, and that has a way of allowing our minds to change the way we see the world. That's what Jesus is after. He is interested in changing the way, shaping the way we see the world so that we come to see life itself and all of reality through the lens of who Jesus reveals God to be. So get ready. Even though these are stories, these aren't necessarily child stories where they're easily unpacked. And sometimes we should be prepared that these stories will take our assumptions and perspective on the world and turn them sideways, reframe things so that what we thought was close up was far away. What we thought was one thing turns out to be another. Be prepared. Jesus intends to surprise us as he shows us who God is in his stories. So continuing on in Mark chapter 4, in verses 10 through 20, Jesus himself gives us an interpretation of what his story is all about. It's almost like when you're learning, say, your math or spelling words when you're in elementary school, and the teacher goes through the lesson with you first, and we all do one together. So here's the problem, and now here I'm going to help you solve it step by step, and now I'm going to give you homework after that. And you're going to do what I did in this explanation. Jesus almost does the same thing, giving us a story and now unpacking it for us. So here's how it goes. When he was alone, those who were around him, along with the 12, asked him about the parables. And he said to them, "To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside, everything comes in parables, in order that they may indeed look, but not perceive, may indeed listen, but not understand, so that they may not turn and be forgiven." And he said to them, "Do you not understand this parable? How will you understand all the parables? The sower sows the word. These are the ones on the path. The ones who are on the path are where the word is sown. When they hear, Satan immediately comes and takes away the word that is sown in them. And these are the ones sown on rocky ground. When they hear the word, they immediately receive it with joy, but they have no root and endure only for a while. And then when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately they fall away. And others are those sown among the thorns. These are the ones who hear the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth and the desire for other things come in and choke the word, and it yields nothing. And these are the ones who are sown on good soil. They hear the word and accept it and bear fruit, 30 and 60 and 100-fold. Okay, so we've just heard Jesus tell a story that is not a super exciting story. Somebody, a farmer, has a handful of seed and scatters it as they go. And some of it falls on the path, and some on thorns, and some on scorched ground, and some on good soil. And there's different response, right? And now Jesus has kind of explained, this isn't a farming story, literally. This is about how different people respond to the one message, to the word that Jesus himself, or maybe even the followers of Jesus who will carry on after him, bring the news, the message that Jesus brought. Now, earlier in Mark's gospel, we sort of got the what's Jesus' message? Mark gives it to us in one sentence. The reign of God has come near. Believe that. Turn, you can be a part of it. The reign of God has come near. That's sort of the heart of the message. And so now here's the question. Okay, if you bring the reign of God, the thing the prophets have been dreaming about for centuries, right? If you're the one who finally brings what we've been waiting for, if you're the one who brings God's own kingdom, God's own way of ruling in the world, I'm sorry, Jesus, this is a little bit embarrassing, but why doesn't it look like it? I mean, how come we all don't recognize it? How come you don't fit our expectations? Notice, over the first several chapters of Mark's gospel, we've already seen a handful of people get who Jesus is. Most of them so far have been supernatural beings, God and demons, and maybe Mark the narrator who knows how the story goes. But why doesn't everybody, in fact, why don't the respectable religious people, why don't they get who Jesus is? Part of Jesus' answer is in a story like this, that Jesus hasn't come in a way that's going to coerce or force everybody. Again, we can quibble about why would God choose this way? Wouldn't we like God to just bring the hammer down and make everybody do what God wants? God has made the choice. This is not how God's going to operate in the world. God comes into the world with a certain vulnerability, with a certain openness that God's love could be unrequited. That God might step into the world and we might be so opposed to what God does that we might crucify the one who is sent. Oh, that's how the story goes, isn't it? In a sense, Jesus telling this story at the outset, and Mark sort of setting this as the framing for all the rest of the stories we'll get about Jesus, is also a way of helping to understand how is it, if Jesus really is the Son of God, if Jesus really is the one who brings the kingdom, how did we end up crucifying him? Well, it has a lot to do with us. Not that Jesus is defective. Not that Jesus' message is defective. Not that the word he hands out to his followers and says, now you go bring the word too. Not that they're defective, or that they didn't have a zinger enough of a story at the end of their sermon, or they didn't have a flashy enough social media presence. It's the word isn't the problem. There's something in us, in all of us when we hear the word. Sometimes we're the ones unwilling to listen. Sometimes we are excited and then we flame out. Sometimes we just let it get choked out or stolen away. Jesus tells a story like this as a way sort of helping us make sense throughout the whole rest of his story, but also throughout the church's witness. Why is it that everybody doesn't immediately get what Jesus is all about or sign up to be on Jesus' team if he really is the Messiah? Why don't we all recognize it? And why doesn't God make us? Well, this is the answer. It's more like scattering seed. The seed can be good, but it's a question of how is it going to be received. And that the way you make a seed come to life, you can't force it, you can't coerce it. No amount of pounding the seed further into the soil will make it grow better. And you can't yell at the seed or yell at the soil to make it grow or to make it prosper, or to make the seed be accepted into the soil and germinate and put up sprouts. It's entirely fragile and risky and happens below the surface. In a lot of ways, that's Jesus saying this is how God has chosen to operate in the world. Not the way that the empires of history do things, right? I mean, the empires, my goodness, their approach, whether it's Rome or Greece or Assyria or Babylon or the Egyptians before them or any of history's other later subsequent empires that we might live in, their approach is we must use force. We'll march in our troops. We'll use our economic wealth. We'll use our political pressure. We'll make you do what we want. We'll force it. Jesus says that's not how God's reign operates. So even though this is a story where Jesus gives an almost like allegorical interpretation, each thing in the story represents something else, right? The seed on the path is like when Satan steals away the message, or the seed in the thorns is like when the cares of the world choke it out. In a sense, it's not with the idea that we're supposed to find, well, which one soil am I? But maybe it's more like, sometimes I've been all of them. But how am I responding when Jesus speaks the word to me? And can I accept the idea that God's coming into the world is an awful lot more like planting a seed in hope, vulnerable and risky, and doesn't look very tough and strong and intimidating, and a lot less like marching an army into town? When the Romans occupied a place, they would announce, with an awful lot of chutzpah or pride, we'll say, they would announce, we have good news for you. We've come to be the saviors of the world. We will conquer you, and that's how we will save you. Caesar Augustus had the guts, the sheer guts, to say it was good news for all the world that he'd been born, because he had come as the savior of the world, marching his soldiers in to conquer people. Jesus says that's not how God actually operates in the world, but instead God's coming to reign in the world is not like I will tramp you down and if you disagree I will squash you, but more I've come to scatter seeds, and if you will let it, if you will let that seed come to blossom in you, life will spring forth. That God's reign doesn't look like soldiers marching into town to destroy or smash in a show of brute force, but that God's kind of reign looks like seeds sprouting up out of the ground. It's a completely upside-down picture, especially from everything that the Romans and the other powerful people are announcing all around all the time. And that seems to be part of why this is so important. Jesus wants to make sure those who are around him, especially his inner circle, get it, right? Okay, you understand what I'm saying here, that God's reign is different than maybe what you expect, and certainly different from when all the other loud voices around. The loud voices around talk about how we have to show our greatness and we must be tough and strong. We can't look like winners. We gotta be important and impressive and powerful and threatening and bellowing and bellicose. And Jesus says, I want you to be clear. That's not who I am, because that's not who God really is. Jesus is intent on nothing less than a revision of what we assume God is like. And if you had listened to, say, the Romans and their official policy, or to King Herod, you might assume God is just a big bully in the sky who makes us do things because God has the power, right? Sending lightning bolts down like Zeus, or hurling thunderbolts like Jupiter. Jesus shows us a different picture, that that's not in the end how God reigns. God has sent Jesus in this under-the-radar way, bringing the reign of God to ordinary people exactly where they are. And Jesus doesn't have to become a head of state, or become a priest at the temple, or start a groundswell violent movement of mercenaries. Instead, Jesus comes armed only with words, living and enacting what God's reign is like. If we get that, then it won't exactly surprise us that different people have different reactions or responses to the word. And instead of writing people off and thinking, well, you didn't respond once, so I'm giving up on you, Jesus pictures this is what God does. God just keeps taking the risk, throwing the seed out everywhere, knowing that's going to look awfully wasteful and maybe even foolish to the watching world. But that in itself is a glimpse of who God is, willing to look reckless and foolish for the sake of reaching us. In the end, Jesus really has it in mind to revise our whole understanding of who God is, and it starts with a story like this one. The next section of chapter 4 is sort of a hodgepodge, a snack mix of little short scenes and stories that are sayings of Jesus that Mark is kind of all grouped together. And it's possible that Jesus gives them all at once, or it's possible that these are things Jesus had said in lots of different individual moments that Mark has kind of grouped together for us. This is something I want us to consider for a moment, to stop, pause, catch our breath, and not to freak out about. We have in our 4 Gospels across our New Testament different storytelling and different collections of the same sets of Jesus' teaching. There's some things that Matthew groups together one way and Mark groups together a different way, and Luke will have a slightly different way, and sometimes John, he's out there. He's got a whole completely different way of putting things together. Sometimes they're dealing with the same stories, but they've grouped them a little bit differently. And either we can get very, very fussy and worried about, well, which one is right and which one is wrong, or we can say, wait a second, maybe, because the gospel writers aren't like giving us a beginning to end, here's everything that ever happened about Jesus. They're movie makers. They take a bunch of footage and they edit it together. They take a bunch of stories and they compile them, and they might come up with different ways to edit them together. And sometimes you'll get somebody like a Matthew who says, oh, I want to group all the teachings about this together in one area. And sometimes you'll get somebody else who narrates things a little bit differently. So it's possible that as we hear several different things all sort of put together, this could be Mark saying, you know what, I've got a number of short little parables of Jesus. I'm going to group them together while I'm talking about parables of Jesus. Because honestly, Mark, who is writing the gospel down at least 30, maybe 40 years or so after the events that happen in the gospel. So decades later, as someone who has heard the stories secondhand, Mark isn't one of those original disciples. He is likely to be a later person who's heard the stories of Jesus, told maybe by the apostles or other early followers of Jesus. But because of that, he might not know exactly what day Jesus said this and when he said that. And for that matter, Jesus, as traveling rabbi, going from place to place, crowd to crowd, probably used different stories or vignettes over and over and over again, because one image could be helpful for a bunch of different groups. Oh, hey, I need to tell these people about how the kingdom of God is like planting a seed. And he might use that in a different moment, in a different situation over and over again. So instead of saying, well, is this the exact order Jesus told them? This is a sampling. This is a collection of things that Jesus taught, of stories Jesus used. So here we go. This is going to be starting with verse 21 and going through to verse 34 of Mark's Gospel, of the 4th chapter. Jesus said to them, is a lamp brought in to be put under the bushel basket or under the bed and not on the lampstand? For there's nothing hidden except to be disclosed, nor is anything secret except to come to light. Let anyone with ears to hear listen. And he said to them, pay attention to what you hear. The measure you give will be the measure you get, and still more will be given to you. For to those who have, more will be given, and from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. He also said, the kingdom of God is as if someone would scatter seed on the ground and would sleep and rise night and day, and the seed would sprout and grow. He does not know how. The earth produces of itself first the stalk, then the head, then the full grain in the head. But when the grain is ripe, at once he goes in with his sickle, because the harvest has come. He also said, with what can we compare the kingdom of God, or what parable will we use for it? It is like a mustard seed, which when sown upon the ground is the smallest of all the seeds on earth. Yet when it is sown, it grows up and becomes the greatest of all shrubs, and puts forth large branches, so that the birds of the air can make nests in its shade. With many such parables he spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it. And he did not speak to them except in parables, but he explained everything in private to his disciples. Okay, so what's going on here? So, again, as we said, we've got a whole collection of a bunch of short little sayings, some of which kind of feel like a story, some are just sort of like an observation, right? This is the almost like the first century rabbinical equivalent of "did you ever notice" kind of humor from a stand-up comedian. Did you ever notice? So that this lampstand. Did you ever notice how you don't put a lampstand under your bed or under a basket? No, you put it on a lampstand so everybody can see the lamp's light, right? Jesus sort of does these short little things, and they are intended to make us think about how God operates in the world. From things like a small seed that looks overlookable, unimportant, negligible, but grows and becomes this big shrub that is in fact so big that birds can come and make their nests in it, right? This is sort of Jesus' way of talking again about how he comes to bring God's reign, God's kingdom, right? It looks like this tiny, small, little, insignificant reality. 12 guys and their rabbi going through towns in the backwater of the empire. How can that change the world? Well, God's reign starts in a small way, and it seems like it doesn't have any power, but watch, and it grows, and in fact becomes so big and sturdy that also it's able to welcome other kinds of life. Birds can live and dwell inside the bush as well. These are little images, but Jesus wants us to see something about how God operates inside them or through them. So each one of these is kind of a little window. Maybe it says just a little bit, shows just a little bit about how Jesus wants us to understand God, allowing the mystery, right? Like the farmer who doesn't quite know how to explain how the harvest grows, but it does, and he trusts, and he acts in faith, trusting, I planted the seed, it's going to happen beyond my power, that God's kingdom, God's reign breaks in. We have this small role. We maybe get to plant seeds, but God works behind the scenes all the time in ways that we don't get to see. This again is kind of helping to unpack and explore, why is it that Jesus coming into the world, why don't we all get it instantly? Well, God's presence is sort of slow, deliberate, almost like a guerrilla movement under the radar, slowly working in hearts, not marching into the capital and overtaking them with like an army, like the Romans do. Jesus is offering an alternative way of seeing the world from the other dominant narratives, the other dominant ways of seeing the world that are floating around all around them. And that's something Mark's holding on to, that Jesus is after a change in mind and a change of perspective in us, that we'll see the world differently. Maybe this last thing we need to hold on to is that Jesus intentionally does this teaching of parables, that this last concluding thing that we read, Jesus spoke many parables to them, and he'd explain it to his disciples in private, but not to the rest of the world. Why might Jesus do that? You might think that Jesus assumes every parable is self-explanatory, and this is just an easy way because people like stories. I'm not sure that it's exactly that people like stories, so much as Jesus has a way of speaking in almost kind of coded language, that Jesus doesn't come out and say things like, death to Rome, that will get you immediately crucified. Or if Jesus comes right out and says things like, don't listen to those Pharisees and scribes, well, that's not exactly fair. He's looking to engage them, not just sort of shout at them. In a sense, the use of stories has a way of drawing people in to think about things. And as we think about Jesus' stories, if it sort of makes something click or makes us poke at, well, why do I think this? Or maybe Jesus is suggesting something I hadn't thought about. It draws us in to think differently. And then as we go back to Jesus, okay, tell us more, Jesus, he's able to flesh out more. Jesus doesn't do what we all are tempted to do in this age of social media, of just blaring out things that are going to shut people down. If you just say something that's going to upset people immediately without any let's think about this, without nuance, without inviting people into critical thinking, man, it's easy to shut. I don't want to listen to that. That's somebody saying I don't like already. I'm not just going to listen to them. Jesus uses stories in a way that get below our radar, that make us think about things differently, that see things through the lens of that story and then see the world differently as well. So even Jesus' way of talking, way of teaching is important. And that maybe says something, too, about how do we interact with other people. If our primary witness in the world is, I need to yell at you the reasons why you're wrong and I'm right, or I need to give you, here's a list of things you have to believe correctly before I will talk to you or love you, a lot of people shut down right off the bat. Or if I immediately start shouting at you, what you think about God is wrong, let me tell you why I'm right, we all get defensive. But if we start with stories, there is this way of making people think, I never thought about it that way. Or we have this way of there's room for faithful imagination, and then there's room for conversation. And when it's in the world of a story, there can be this sort of playful back and forth, this sort of let's think about this, almost like the freedom to think about things in a thought experiment. That's part of the beauty of how Jesus uses stories. He invites us in to think about things maybe in ways we hadn't thought of before, and then to allow that to change us as we go forward. That's kind of our calling, both to be people who let Jesus' story shape our view of the world, but then also how do we engage other people in ways that listen to their stories? And then we can tell our stories as well, side by side, instead of, I'm here to knock on your door and tell you everything that you think is wrong, but instead we can have conversation. Tell me about your story. Let me tell you my story. Let's see where they meet. Let's see where God is in between. That's a lot more powerful way of connecting with other people than beating down the door or yelling at them on social media. Jesus knew it 2,000 years ago. What if we let Jesus' storytelling get under our skin too? That brings us to our last section in Mark chapter 4. It's a scene and it's a story that is well known. It's an exciting, riveting story, and it comes here in verses 35 through 41. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." That's the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat on the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. They woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" There's a lot in there, right? Not only is there Jesus' permission to take naps because he's taking a nap in the back of the boat, more importantly, several things sort of come together in the scene. One, right at the outset, it's almost sort of like hinted at like we're setting up a future scene because that's what Mark's doing. In the beginning of the scene, Jesus, he's been there on the edge of the water. He'd been using sort of the hillside by the shore as a natural amphitheater. He could be in the boat there at the edge of the water, talking out there to the people out there. They can hear him better and more clearly. But now he's ready to go. He gets in the boat. They go across to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is a lake. It is just basically a decent-sized lake in northern, what we would call Israel or Palestine today. And one side of that shore, of that lake, is Jewish territory, and the other side sort of has the ring of, those people live over there. That's Gentile territory. That's where those people live, people who are outside the boundaries of ancient Israel. Even though Rome and the other empires since had sort of redrawn the boundary lines, that's Gentile territory. And here on this side, this is where we Jewish people live. We noted already Jesus has sort of implicitly allowed outsiders to come meet him where he was, right? He was holding court, healing and teaching and things like that, and people from other areas would come to him. Now the trajectory goes a step further. And I think Mark is deliberately kind of warming us up to this idea. Not only does Jesus let people come to him from wherever, including those outside or Gentile people, now Jesus is about the one to cross the border, to go over to the other side where those Gentiles are. And he's just sort of laying it out there. In the very opening of the next chapter, there's going to be an important scene that happens, and it's important to recognize it's in Gentile territory, non-Jewish territory where it happens. But Mark is sort of getting us ready for it right here. Now, if we read all of Mark's gospel all at once, probably the way he intended it originally, we'd get that connection more immediately and more clearly. But when we get to next time, let's remember in Mark chapter 5, Mark has sort of primed the pump for us, getting us ready for the idea. Jesus is intentionally going to the other side of the sea. Jesus, who would have known all his life. There's our side and their side. There's the good side of the tracks and the bad side of the tracks. There's our kind of people and those kind of people. And there are a million social pressures telling you don't cross, don't be involved with those people. They're outsiders, they're different, they're the wrong ethnic group, language, religion, culture. There's a long list of reasons why you don't go to those people. And Jesus gets in the boat intentionally to cross that imaginary boundary. Okay, that's the first thing. Second of all, Jesus falls asleep in the boat. Again, you have permission to take naps. That's not what the whole thing is about, but let's remember, Mark does want us to see Jesus as completely, really, fully, truly human, as well as being the Son of God. It's not either or. Mark presents us Jesus who is absolutely, utterly human, like us, and takes naps and gets hungry and sometimes is sad and heartbroken. It's not that Jesus never slept, never needed anything, never got hungry, never was lonely. Jesus knows all of that and at the same time also brings us the very presence of God in his own life. Both are true at the same time. So even though Mark doesn't give us the exact wording of, say, the Nicene Creed, which spells out Jesus is God from God, light from light, true God from true God, and human and divine and all that. Mark doesn't give us all that precise language. He shows us Jesus does things that human beings do without apologizing or blushing about it, and Jesus does things that only God can do. And that brings us to the conclusion of this scene. Not only do we get Jesus super duper, absolutely, completely human like us, taking a nap in the back of the boat, but then when the storm kicks up, Jesus speaks to the wind and the waves, and they obey him. We're back to the authority thing. We're back to the who is Jesus thing, right? All throughout the gospel so far, we've seen this recurring. Where does Jesus get off doing things like forgiving sins? Where does Jesus have the ability to cast out demons? Is he in league with the demons? And Jesus answers, but no, I really have the authority from God because I really am God's chosen Messiah. I'm the one we've been waiting for. I am God with it. Jesus says and does things that only God is allowed to do and only God has the power to do. Throughout the scriptures, throughout the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, there's recurring images of God is the one who rides the wind and calm the sea. God's the one who parts the waves right at the Red Sea. God's the one who controls the sea and tames the water and sends the wind and controls the storm. And now Jesus does these things, as if to say Jesus comes with the same authority of the God of ancient Israel. Mark doesn't come out and say, this is my way of telling you that Jesus is God in the flesh, but he gives us those raw things. He says, here's 2 + 2, and he trusts that we can come up with 4. That's sort of the hanging irony at the end of this chapter, where the disciples who have watched all this happen are left with the question, who is this guy that the wind and the waves obey him? And beautifully, as a fantastic storyteller, Mark gives us the question, and he doesn't feel the need to give the editorial answer. He doesn't say, by the way, I'm going to tell you Jesus is God. He's just shown us. He's shown us Jesus doing things that only God can do, as well as being the guy taking a nap in the back of the boat. He's given us this raw material, as if to say, I know who Jesus is. You all know Jesus really is God in the flesh. How is it that these people can miss it, right? And that's part of the beauty of it too. Even though Mark told us at the beginning, Jesus is the Son of God, he tells us a story about followers of Jesus, handpicked disciples, right? Peter, James, John, Andrew, all those guys who were there with Jesus, he chose them. And yet, as they're watching miracles happen, they're thick-headed and don't quite get it. They're dense, they don't quite understand. There's hope for all of us. I think that's part of the picture that Mark is also telling as well. Not just who Jesus is, but that, look, Jesus picks people who often don't get it and miss the point and are dismissed by the rest of the world as not good enough or not important enough and not intelligent enough. We're people who often get it wrong about Jesus. And that doesn't disqualify us or say that we were wrong about Jesus. It means Jesus is willing to work with us, even for all our flaws and clay feet, and sometimes all the way up to our top of our clay heads. Jesus is willing to work with folks who often don't get it and miss the point. This is how Jesus operates in the world. He picks the people that everybody else discarded and thought weren't good enough, weren't useful enough. The people who don't always have the right answers, who don't have power or wealth or political pull. He picks a bunch of anybodies and nobodies. And Mark doesn't pretend that instantly we all become superheroes or geniuses just because we're on Jesus' team. We're sometimes going to see a miracle and go, who is this guy? Without getting it. Now, it's obvious who this Jesus is. The story of Jesus is the story of God coming with us, with all the power of who God is, but also all the ordinariness of who we are. God chooses us, calls us as we are, and works with us just as we are to do something amazing that maybe doesn't take the world by storm, like marching your army into the capital to conquer your enemy, but that grows while nobody's watching, like a seed planted in the soil that springs up after you've taken the risk of planting it and scattering and running the risk that some of the seed might not come to fruition, but you'd keep doing it anyway. That's how God operates. God keeps putting good into the world, planting the seed, sending us with the word, running the risk that we might blow it sometimes, that we won't get it, and that the world will reject it. But that's how God shows up in the world, behind the scenes, under the radar, like a sprouting seed poking its head up out of the soil. Join us next time as we take a look at Mark chapter 5 here in our journey with Jesus, going through the Gospel of Mark. Thanks for being with us today.